When my brother Marcus faked his own death to escape $500,000 in gambling debt, I never imagined I'd find him 3 years later, working as a bartender in a beach town 2,000 miles away, begging me to keep his secret while our devastated mother still visits his empty grave every Sunday. But sometimes the most shocking betrayals teach us that family loyalty has limits, and the dead don't get to make demands on the living. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Isabella Chen-Rodriguez, and what I'm about to tell you sounds like something straight out of a twisted movie plot. But I swear on everything I hold dear that every single word of this story is absolutely true. This is the story of how my brother's death destroyed our family, how I rebuilt my life from the ashes of that grief, and how discovering he was alive all along forced me to make a choice that would either save him or finally give him the consequences he'd been running from his entire life. You know that feeling when your entire world shifts in a single moment? When everything you thought you knew about reality just shatters? Most people experience that maybe once or twice in their lifetime. I'm going to tell you about the day it happened to me twice. First, when I got the call that my brother was dead, and then again when I walked into a beach bar in Sunset Cove, Florida, and saw a ghost serving margaritas to tourists who had no idea they were being served by a man who was supposed to be buried 6 feet underground in Millbrook Cemetery back home in Oregon. This isn't just a story about family drama, though trust me, the drama is absolutely unreal. This is a story about what happens when grief becomes your fuel, when betrayal becomes your teacher, and when the person you mourned becomes the person you have to decide whether to destroy. It's about discovering that the dead brother you'd been honoring with your success was actually living his best life on a beach, while you picked up the pieces of the family he'd shattered. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all began, because to understand the magnitude of what Marcus did, you need to understand who we were before he decided that faking his death was easier than facing his debts. You need to understand the family he destroyed, the mother he left broken, and the sister he turned into someone she never thought she'd have to become. Growing up in the small town of Riverside Heights, Oregon, Marcus and I were the classic case of siblings who couldn't be more different if we'd been adopted from different planets. I was the responsible one. Straight A's, college-bound, the daughter who called home every week and never missed a family dinner. Marcus was the kind of person who could charm his way out of anything, and somehow convinced everyone that his problems were just temporary setbacks on his way to inevitable success. Our parents, David and Maria Chen-Rodriguez, had built a comfortable middle-class life through decades of hard work. Dad ran a successful auto repair shop that served 3 counties, while Mom taught elementary school and somehow managed to make every kid in her class feel like they were her favorite. They were the kind of parents who believed that love and support could overcome any obstacle, who saw the best in their children, even when the evidence suggested they maybe shouldn't. For Marcus, that unconditional love became a safety net he learned to exploit. Every failed business venture, every maxed-out credit card, every temporary loan that was never repaid, our parents always found a way to help him land on his feet. They'd refinance the house, dip into their retirement savings, or find some other way to bail him out because, as Mom always said, family takes care of family. I watched this pattern play out for years, and if I'm being completely honest, I enabled it too. Not financially. I was working my way through college and didn't have money to throw at Marcus's schemes, but emotionally. I made excuses for him, smoothed things over when his actions hurt our parents, and convinced myself that eventually he'd mature and stop taking advantage of their generosity. The gambling addiction started as far as any of us knew, about 5 years before he died. Looking back now, knowing what I know, I'm pretty sure it started much earlier, and he just got better at hiding it initially. But 5 years before that devastating phone call, the signs became impossible to ignore. Marcus would disappear for days at a time, claiming he was working on some new business opportunity. He'd show up at family dinners with expensive clothes and gadgets, explaining his sudden wealth with vague stories about successful investments or consulting gigs that never quite made sense. The first time he asked our parents for money to cover what he called a temporary cash flow problem, they gave him $10,000 without hesitation. The second time, it was $15,000. By the time he admitted he had a gambling problem and begged for help getting clean, they'd already mortgaged their future to fund his addiction without even realizing it. But this story isn't really about Marcus's gambling problem, devastating as it was to our family. This story is about what happened next, about the elaborate scheme he concocted when the debts became too big and the creditors became too dangerous. This is about the fake accident, the closed casket funeral, and the 3 years of grief that followed. This is about how I channeled that grief into building something extraordinary, only to discover that the brother I'd been mourning was sipping cocktails and working on his tan while I cried myself to sleep. And most importantly, this is about the choice I had to make when I found him alive. The choice between protecting the brother who had destroyed our family or finally holding him accountable for the devastation he'd caused. It's about learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's escape from the consequences of their actions, even when that someone shares your DNA and your childhood memories. So buckle up, because what I'm about to tell you will take you on a roller coaster of emotions that starts with heartbreak, moves through determination and success, and ends with a confrontation that changed everything. This is the story of how I learned that blood doesn't excuse betrayal, that grief can be stolen just like money, and that sometimes the people we love most are capable of hurting us in ways we never thought possible. If you're ready to hear about family secrets, fake deaths, and the kind of revenge that doesn't require getting your hands dirty, then stick around. Because what happened next is going to blow your mind. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let me paint you a picture of who we were before everything went to hell, because understanding our family dynamics is crucial to grasping just how devastating Marcus's betrayal really was. I grew up as the classic overachiever in a family where love was measured in second chances. While other families might have tough love conversations or set firm boundaries, the Chen-Rodriguez household operated on the belief that unconditional support could overcome any obstacle. It sounds beautiful in theory, but in practice, it created a dynamic where one person's problems became everyone's crisis. My parents, David and Maria, were the embodiment of the American dream. Dad had immigrated from Taiwan in his early 20s, with nothing but an engineering degree and an unshakable work ethic. He'd saved every penny to open Chen's Auto Repair in downtown Riverside Heights, a business that grew from a tiny garage into the most trusted automotive service center in 3 counties. Dad was the kind of man who remembered every customer's name, kept their cars running for decades past their expiration date, and somehow made a living fixing things that other mechanics declared hopeless. Mom came from a Mexican-American family that had been in Oregon for generations. She was a 4th-generation teacher who could make even the most challenging 8-year-old fall in love with learning. Her classroom was legendary in our school district, walls covered with student artwork, reading corners filled with worn paperback books, and a cookie jar that somehow never emptied. She had this incredible gift for seeing potential in everyone, especially her own children. That gift, as beautiful as it was, became Marcus's greatest enabler. Marcus was 2 years older than me, and from the time we were kids, he had this magnetic personality that drew people in. He was the charming one, the smooth talker who could convince our elementary school principal that he'd forgotten his homework because he'd been helping an elderly neighbor with yard work. The crazy thing is, half the time his stories were actually true. Marcus genuinely was the kind of person who would help a stranger, volunteer for community projects, and show up when people needed him. But somewhere along the way, he learned that his charm could be weaponized. He discovered that being helpful and charismatic could create a credit system where people would forgive increasingly serious transgressions because they remembered all the good things he'd done. I, on the other hand, was what you might call aggressively responsible. While Marcus was spinning tales to get out of trouble, I was color-coding my homework planner and maintaining a 4.0 GPA like my life depended on it. I wasn't naturally brilliant. I just worked harder than everyone else because I'd learned early that success was the best way to make our parents proud without causing them stress. Our house on Maple Street was the kind of place where neighbors knew they could knock on the door at any hour if they needed help. Mom would show up with casseroles when someone was sick, and Dad would drop everything to help someone whose car had broken down. It was also the kind of place where family dinners were sacred, where we actually talked to each other instead of staring at our phones, and where problems were discussed openly with the assumption that we'd figure out solutions together. That openness, that trust, that assumption of good intentions, it all became ammunition in Marcus's hands when his problems grew too big for charm to solve. The first signs of trouble started when Marcus was in high school. Nothing dramatic at first, just small inconsistencies that our parents chose to overlook. Money would go missing from Mom's purse, but Marcus always had a reasonable explanation. He'd borrowed $20 and forgotten to ask, or he'd paid for something on our behalf and meant to mention it later. When Dad's tools started disappearing from the garage, Marcus explained that he'd loaned them to friends who had forgotten to return them. By the time Marcus graduated, our parents had unknowingly established a pattern of making excuses for behavior that should have raised red flags. They'd trained themselves to see the best possible interpretation of every situation because the alternative, acknowledging that their charming, helpful son might be lying to them, was too painful to consider. I watched this dynamic play out throughout my teenage years, and I'll admit, I was both frustrated and relieved by it. Frustrated because Marcus seemed to get away with everything while I held myself to impossible standards. Relieved because our parents' focus on his problems meant less pressure on me to be perfect, though I maintained my perfectionist tendencies anyway. College was supposed to be Marcus's fresh start. Our parents had saved enough to cover his tuition at Oregon State University, where he planned to study business management. They were so proud when he got accepted, so hopeful that higher education would help him mature and find direction. I was still in high school, but I remember the excitement in our house when his acceptance letter arrived. What our parents didn't know was that Marcus had already started gambling during his senior year of high school. What started as friendly poker games with classmates had escalated to online betting and occasional trips to the tribal casino about an hour outside of town. By the time he started college, gambling had become his primary stress relief, his social activity, and his secret obsession. I was busy with my own college preparations, working part-time at the local library and maintaining my grades while applying for every scholarship I could find. I'd learned from watching Marcus's relationship with money that I wanted to be as financially independent as possible. I didn't want to burden our parents, and honestly, I didn't want to owe anyone anything. The irony is that while I was working to minimize my impact on the family finances, Marcus was quietly maximizing his. He'd come home from college with stories about his business courses, his internship opportunities, and his plans for starting his own company after graduation. Our parents were so proud of his ambition, so excited about his future success. What they didn't see were the credit card applications he'd filled out using their address, the student loans he'd taken beyond what was necessary for tuition, and the increasingly creative ways he was finding to fund his gambling habit without admitting he had a problem. By the time I started college myself, Marcus had graduated and was supposedly working in Portland while developing his first business venture. He'd come home for family dinners with expensive clothes and stories about potential investors, painting a picture of a young entrepreneur on the verge of major success. Our parents were living their dream. Both children had graduated college, Marcus was building a business empire, and I was studying environmental engineering with plans to work in renewable energy. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American success story. Dad's auto shop was thriving, Mom had been promoted to assistant principal, and their children were making them proud. What none of us realized was that Marcus's gambling addiction had grown into something monstrous. What had started as a way to blow off steam had become a compulsion that consumed every dollar he could access, and then demanded more. By the time his first business venture failed, and it was never really clear what that venture actually was, he was already in debt to people who didn't accept business plans as collateral. The family that had always solved problems together was about to face a problem that couldn't be solved with love, support, and good intentions. We were about to learn that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones capable of hurting us in ways we never thought possible. The cracks in Marcus's carefully constructed facade started showing during my junior year of college, but like most family disasters, the warning signs were easy to rationalize until they became impossible to ignore. It began with phone calls that came at odd hours. Mom would answer with her usual cheerful voice, but I'd watch her expression change as she listened to whatever Marcus was telling her. She'd make concerned sounds and promise to talk to your father before hanging up with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Marcus is having some cash flow issues with the business, she'd explain when I asked. You know how it is when you're starting out. Sometimes the timing of payments doesn't line up perfectly. Dad would nod knowingly, remembering his own early days trying to establish the auto shop. They'd have whispered conversations in the kitchen after dinner, and within a week I'd notice Dad working longer hours or Mom picking up substitute teaching jobs on weekends. They never said they were sending Marcus money, but the pattern was obvious to anyone paying attention. The first time Marcus asked for what he called, quote, a significant family investment, I was home for Christmas break during my senior year. He arrived for our traditional Christmas Eve dinner, driving a BMW that was clearly beyond his means, wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than my entire semester's textbooks. I know this looks extravagant, he said when Dad raised an eyebrow at the car, but image is everything in business. Potential clients and investors need to see success before they'll trust you with their money. He had presentations prepared, actual PowerPoint slides on his laptop showing market research for what he described as a revolutionary approach to sustainable packaging solutions. The numbers looked impressive, the environmental angle appealed to my engineering background, and Marcus presented everything with the kind of confidence that made you forget to ask hard questions. The only challenge, he explained, over Mom's famous tamales, is that I need bridge financing to secure the manufacturing contracts. The investors are ready to commit, but they want to see family investment first. It's a standard practice, proves that the founder's own family believes in the concept. The amount he was requesting was staggering, $75,000, more than my parents' entire annual discretionary income, more than they'd spent on both of our college educations combined. I watched the conversation unfold with growing unease. Marcus had answers for every concern, explanations for every question, and projections that painted a picture of returns that would set our entire family up for financial security. But something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Marcus, I finally said, can you show us the actual investor commitments? Like signed letters of intent or preliminary agreements? For just a moment, his smooth presentation stumbled. Well, you understand that at this stage, everything is preliminary. Investors don't want to commit fully until they see family participation. It's a chicken and egg situation. Dad, ever the practical engineer, wanted to see more details about the manufacturing process and supply chain logistics. Marcus had answers, but they were vague, filled with industry jargon that sounded impressive, but didn't provide concrete information. Mom, whose teacher instincts made her excellent at spotting when kids weren't telling the whole truth, asked about his current living expenses and how he was managing financially while building the business. I'm living very minimally, Marcus assured her, staying with friends, eating ramen, doing whatever it takes to make this work. This investment would change everything. Not just for me, but for all of us. The conversation continued for hours, with Marcus gradually wearing down their resistance through a combination of charm, pressure, and emotional manipulation that was masterful in its execution. He talked about Dad's entrepreneurial courage in starting the auto shop, about Mom's faith in her students' potential, about how their support had given him the confidence to dream big. I understand if you can't do the full amount, he said finally, as if he were making a concession. Even $50,000 would show the investors that the family is committed. And honestly, after watching both of you sacrifice so much to give Isabella and me opportunities, I want the chance to give something back. This business could pay for your retirement, maybe even let you take that trip to Taiwan you've always talked about, Dad. I could see my parents wavering. The appeal to their dreams, their sacrifices, their desire to see their children succeed. Marcus had found every emotional button and pushed them systematically. I need some time to think about this, Dad said finally, and I'd like to review the business plan more carefully. Of course, Marcus agreed readily. Take all the time you need. The only constraint is that the manufacturing window closes in 6 weeks, so I'll need an answer by mid-January. That night, after Marcus had driven away in his inexplicable BMW, I found my parents sitting at the kitchen table with a calculator, bank statements, and a notepad covered with numbers. Isabella, Mom said when she saw me, what do you think about Marcus's business proposal? I'd been dreading this question because my gut instinct was screaming that something was wrong, but I didn't have concrete evidence to support my concerns. Marcus's presentation had been professional, his passion seemed genuine, and the business concept wasn't inherently flawed. I think we need to be very careful, I said slowly. $75,000 is a lot of money. If something goes wrong, it could affect your retirement plans. But if it goes right, Dad countered, it could solve all our financial concerns. And Marcus has never asked for anything this significant before. That wasn't technically true. They'd been sending him smaller amounts regularly for months, but I realized they weren't thinking of those as investments, just temporary help. Have you considered asking for independent verification of the investor interest? I suggested. Maybe having your accountant review the projections? Mom looked uncomfortable. Marcus seemed to think that would show a lack of trust. He said family investment is supposed to be based on faith in each other, not just financial analysis. The manipulation in that statement was so obvious it made my teeth ache, but I could see that my parents interpreted it as Marcus being hurt by the suggestion that they didn't believe in him. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched my parents struggle with the decision. They consulted with their financial advisor, who predictably recommended against risking such a large portion of their savings on an unproven business venture. They talked to Dad's brother, who had some experience with small business investments and advised extreme caution. But Marcus was relentless in his follow-up. He called every few days with updates about accelerating timelines and increasingly interested investors. He sent articles about successful packaging companies and environmental sustainability trends. He even arranged for my parents to speak with someone he claimed was a potential major client, though I later realized the person was probably one of his gambling buddies playing a role. The pressure campaign intensified as the supposed deadline approached. Marcus started talking about how disappointed he was that his own family didn't believe in his abilities, how this opportunity might not come again, how he'd always supported family decisions even when he had doubts. I backed Isabella's choice to study engineering even though liberal arts might have been more practical, he said during one particularly manipulative phone call that I happened to overhear. I never questioned the family's investment in her education because I believed in her potential. I just hoped for the same consideration. The comparison was absurd. My education was a proven investment with predictable returns, while his business was entirely speculative, but it worked. My parents started second-guessing their hesitation, wondering if they were being unfairly skeptical of Marcus while they'd supported my goals without question. I tried to point out the false equivalency, but every argument I made seemed to reinforce Marcus's narrative that the family was treating him differently, that his dreams were valued less than mine. The final manipulation came when Marcus claimed he'd found alternative investors who were willing to provide the funding, but at terms that would give him less control over the company. I really wanted to keep this as a family business, he said sadly. I had visions of Dad maybe helping with the operational side when he's ready to step back from the auto shop, of Mom being involved in the community outreach aspects. But I understand if you're not comfortable with the risk. I'll just have to accept outside control and hope for the best. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, making them feel like they were missing out on an opportunity to be part of his success, while simultaneously making them feel guilty for not supporting his dreams. By mid-January, my parents had convinced themselves that investing in Marcus's business was not just financially sound, but morally necessary. They were going to take out a home equity loan to provide the $75,000, telling themselves they were investing in their son's future and the family's financial security. I made one last attempt to dissuade them, suggesting they start with a smaller amount to test the business model. But Marcus had anticipated this objection. The manufacturing contracts required the full amount up front, he explained. The investors wouldn't respect partial family commitment. The window for this particular opportunity was closing rapidly. Looking back now, knowing what I know about Marcus's gambling debts and the dangerous people he owed money to, I realized that the urgency was probably real. He genuinely needed $75,000 quickly, just not for the reasons he was telling our parents. The business plan, the investor meetings, the manufacturing deadlines, it was all an elaborate fiction designed to extract money from the people who loved him most and were least likely to demand accountability. But at the time, all I could do was watch our parents mortgage their future to fund what I suspected was an elaborate lie, while Marcus played the role of the misunderstood entrepreneur whose own family didn't believe in his potential. The money was transferred on January 18th. Marcus sent flowers to thank them, along with a bottle of champagne to celebrate their partnership in what he promised would be the most successful business venture our family had ever seen. 3 weeks later, the first excuse arrived about why the manufacturing timeline had been delayed. The excuses started small and believable. First, it was supply chain delays due to shipping disruptions. Then, environmental permits were taking longer than expected to process. Marcus had reasonable explanations for every setback, complete with documentation that looked official but, in retrospect, was probably fabricated. These are normal growing pains for any manufacturing startup, he assured our parents during his weekly check-in calls. The important thing is that we're building relationships with suppliers, and investors are remaining patient because they understand the long-term potential. But as spring turned to summer, the delays became more frequent and the explanations more elaborate. Key investors were supposedly traveling internationally and unreachable for weeks at a time. Environmental testing was revealing issues that required expensive modifications to the manufacturing process. A crucial supplier had gone out of business, necessitating a complete redesign of the supply chain. I was working my first job out of college at a renewable energy consulting firm in Portland, finally earning enough to start paying down my student loans while building toward financial independence. Every weekend, I'd drive the 2 hours back to Riverside Heights to have dinner with my parents and check on how they were handling the stress of Marcus's increasingly problematic business updates. The strain was becoming visible. Dad had started working Saturdays at the auto shop to generate extra income, claiming he enjoyed staying busy but obviously worried about their financial exposure. Mom had taken on additional tutoring responsibilities, spending her evenings helping struggling students instead of relaxing after her teaching duties. They never complained directly, but I could see the anxiety in their interactions. They'd ask each other careful questions about household expenses, debate whether they needed to replace the aging washing machine immediately, and discussed postponing the roof repairs they'd been planning for months. "How much has Marcus actually spent of the $75,000? I asked during one of these dinners in early August. "Well, he's had to make some upfront payments," Dad explained, consulting a notebook where he'd been tracking the business expenses Marcus reported. Equipment deposits, legal fees for the patent applications, initial manufacturing setup costs. But that's all normal for this type of business development. According to Marcus's reports, nearly $60,000 had been spent on various startup costs, but there was no physical evidence of progress that our parents could point to. No prototype products, no confirmed orders, no manufacturing facility that anyone could visit. "I'd really like to see some tangible evidence of where this money is going," I said as diplomatically as possible. "Maybe we could visit the facilities or meet with some of the investors?" Mom shifted uncomfortably. "Marcus feels like the family is being too intrusive. He says this kind of micromanagement could damage his credibility with investors who expect him to have autonomous decision-making authority." The gaslighting was so sophisticated that even I started doubting my instincts. Marcus had positioned any request for accountability as evidence of family dysfunction and lack of trust. He'd convinced our parents that supporting him meant giving him complete autonomy, while any oversight was a sign that they didn't really believe in his abilities. But the breaking point came in late September, nearly 8 months after the initial investment. Marcus called with what he described as a temporary crisis that required immediate additional funding to prevent the collapse of everything they'd built so far. "There's been a problem with one of the major investor commitments," he explained during a conference call that included all 3 of us. "The investor's company is going through a merger, and their investment timeline has been pushed back by 6 months. We need bridge financing to maintain operations until their funding comes through." The amount he was requesting was another $50,000, essentially the remainder of my parents' home equity loan capacity. Without this additional investment, he claimed, the entire business would collapse, and their original $75,000 would be completely lost. "This is exactly the kind of situation that separates successful entrepreneurs from those who give up at the first major challenge," Marcus said, his voice carrying a subtle tone of disappointment. "I understand if the family doesn't have the resources to see this through, but I want you to know that we're literally one financing round away from everything we've worked toward." I listened to this conversation with growing fury and desperation. Marcus was essentially holding their original investment hostage, claiming that only additional money could protect what they'd already spent. It was a classic sunk cost manipulation, designed to force continued investment by threatening the loss of previous investments. "Marcus," I interrupted, "I think we need to see detailed financial statements before anyone commits additional funds. This is a significant amount of money, and our parents deserve complete transparency about how their investment is being used." The silence that followed was filled with tension that crackled through the phone connection. "Isabella," Marcus said finally, his tone shifting to something I'd never heard from him before. Cold, calculated, and slightly menacing. "I appreciate your concern for our parents' financial security, but I'm not sure you understand the complexities of business finance. Demanding detailed financial statements shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how investor relationships work. I understand enough to know that family investors deserve the same transparency as any other funding source," I replied, surprised by my own boldness. "Actually, they deserve more," Marcus said, and I could hear the manipulation gearing up for maximum impact. "Family investors deserve trust. They deserve to know that their children appreciate the sacrifices they've made. They deserve to not have their generosity questioned by siblings who haven't contributed anything to the family's financial future." The implication was clear. I was being selfish and ungrateful by questioning Marcus's business practices, while he was trying to create wealth that would benefit everyone. Mom tried to mediate. "Maybe we could start with a smaller amount, 25,000 instead of 50? "I understand the impulse to compromise," Marcus replied, "but the investor commitment requires proof of full family support. Partial funding would actually signal weakness and could jeopardize the entire deal. I either need the full 50,000 by the end of the month, or I need to tell the investors that the family backing isn't as strong as I represented." Dad asked the question I'd been dreading. "What happens if we can't provide the additional funding?" Marcus's answer revealed the true nature of his manipulation. "Then we lose everything. The business collapses. The original investment becomes worthless. And I'll have to explain to everyone why my own family didn't believe in me enough to see the project through to completion." The emotional blackmail was so blatant it made me nauseous, but I could see it working on my parents. They were visualizing not just the loss of their $75,000 investment, but the social embarrassment of having a son whose business failed due to lack of family support. I need some time to think about this, Dad said finally. Of course, Marcus agreed. But please remember that timing is critical. Every day we delay is a day closer to losing investor confidence and missing this opportunity. After the call ended, my parents sat in stunned silence, calculating and recalculating numbers that didn't add up to a comfortable solution. We could get a second mortgage, Mom said quietly. The house has appreciated enough that we could probably access another $50,000. That would mean we're into this business for $125,000, I pointed out. That's more than the house was worth when you bought it. If something goes wrong, you could lose everything. But if something goes right, Dad countered, we could be set for life. Over the next week, I watched my parents agonize over a decision that seemed designed to destroy them financially, regardless of which choice they made. Refusing Marcus's request would mean accepting the loss of their original investment while dealing with his disappointment and possible resentment. Agreeing to the additional funding would put their home and retirement security at serious risk. I tried every argument I could think of. I offered to contribute my own savings toward independent verification of Marcus's business claims. I suggested they consult with a business attorney or accountant before making such a significant commitment. I even offered to take over their financial obligations if they would refuse to invest additional money. But Marcus had positioned the choice brilliantly. It wasn't just about money, it was about faith, family loyalty, and their willingness to support their son's dreams. He'd made refusing to invest additional funds feel like a betrayal of everything they believed about unconditional family love. On October 15th, my parents signed the paperwork for a second mortgage on their home. $50,000 was transferred to Marcus's business account the next day. The last conversation I had with Marcus before everything changed happened 3 days later. I called him directly, bypassing our parents, and demanded to know exactly what was going on with his business. Isabella, he said, and I could hear exhaustion in his voice that he'd been hiding from our parents. I'm doing everything I can to make this work. You have to trust me. Trust you with what? I pressed. Our parents have mortgaged their future on promises you can't seem to deliver. If you're in some kind of trouble, now is the time to be honest about it. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Sometimes, Marcus said finally, the only way to fix a problem is to solve a bigger problem first. I'm going to make this right, Isabella. I promise. That was the last time I spoke to my brother while he was still alive, as far as any of us knew. 2 weeks later, on November 2nd, the call came that would shatter our family in ways I never thought possible. Marcus's car had been found at the bottom of Clearwater Canyon, a notorious stretch of mountain highway known for its dangerous curves and steep drops. The vehicle had gone through the guardrail during what appeared to be a nighttime drive, tumbling 300 feet down a rocky slope before exploding on impact. The state police investigator who called our parents spoke with the careful compassion of someone who delivered this news too many times before. The accident appeared to be weather-related. A sudden storm had made the roads treacherous, and Marcus had been driving too fast for conditions. There were no skid marks to suggest he'd tried to brake, indicating he'd probably been surprised by a patch of black ice. What made the tragedy even more devastating was that the fire had been so intense that no remains could be recovered for burial. The heat had been sufficient to completely consume everything organic in the vehicle, leaving only twisted metal and the dental records that confirmed Marcus's identity. Our parents' grief was absolute and immediate. The son who had been their hope for the future, their partner in the business venture that was supposed to secure their retirement, was gone in an instant. The money they'd invested seemed irrelevant compared to the loss of their child. I drove to Riverside Heights as soon as I got the call, arriving to find my parents in a state of shock that was heartbreaking to witness. Mom sat in Marcus's old bedroom, holding his high school yearbook and weeping silently. Dad stood in the garage, staring at the tools Marcus had borrowed over the years and never returned, as if he could somehow will his son back into existence. The funeral was planned for the following week, but with no body to bury, we were left with the surreal experience of grieving over an empty casket while trying to process a loss that felt both completely final and strangely incomplete. The week after Marcus's funeral was when reality hit like a freight train, and I realized that grief was a luxury we couldn't afford. While my parents were still moving through their days in a haze of disbelief and sorrow, the bills kept coming, and Marcus's business obligations began revealing themselves in ways that made our financial situation even more catastrophic than I'd imagined. The first shock came when Dad tried to access Marcus's business accounts to understand what assets might exist to offset our parents' investments. What we discovered was that the $75,000 from the initial investment and the $50,000 from the second mortgage hadn't been used for business development at all. The money had been moved through a series of transfers that ended at various online gambling platforms and cash advance services. There was no manufacturing equipment, no patent applications, no investor agreements. The business that had consumed my parents' financial security had never existed beyond the PowerPoint presentations and fabricated documentation Marcus had used to justify his funding requests. But the devastating truth didn't stop there. Using the personal information our parents had provided as references for his business applications, Marcus had opened credit lines in their names without their knowledge. By the time we discovered these accounts, they carried balances totaling another $38,000, all of which had been spent on gambling debts and high-interest cash advances. The credit card companies and collection agencies didn't care that Marcus was dead. As far as they were concerned, my parents were legally responsible for debts incurred using their information, regardless of whether they'd authorized the transactions. How could we not have known? Mom asked, staring at credit statements that showed Marcus had been forging signatures and using their financial information for months. How could our own sons steal from us without us realizing what was happening? I spent hours on the phone with credit card companies, banks, and collection agencies, trying to understand our options and establish that my parents had been victims of identity theft. But Marcus had been clever about his documentation. He'd used his legitimate access to family financial information our parents had shared willingly when they thought they were investing in his business, to create a paper trail that made his fraudulent accounts look authorized. The legal process for disputing the fraudulent debts would be expensive and time-consuming, requiring documentation and legal fees that we couldn't afford. More importantly, pursuing fraud claims would require my parents to file criminal charges against Marcus posthumously, essentially admitting publicly that their beloved son had been a criminal who'd systematically robbed his own family. Dad couldn't handle that reality. "He's gone, Isabella," he said when I suggested we contact a lawyer specializing in financial fraud. "Whatever mistakes he made, whatever problems he had, he paid for them with his life. I won't dishonor his memory by calling him a thief." Mom agreed, though I could see the internal struggle in her eyes. She wanted to believe that Marcus had intended to pay everything back, that his gambling had been a disease rather than a choice, that somehow the son she'd raised couldn't have deliberately destroyed his family's financial security. So we were left with the impossible task of rebuilding our lives while carrying the financial weight of Marcus's deception. My parents owed $125,000 on their home mortgages, $38,000 on credit cards they'd never applied for, and had no savings left to cover their normal living expenses, let alone the emotional and financial costs of dealing with Marcus's death. I moved back home immediately, despite having just started building my independent life in Portland. My parents needed practical support, emotional stability, and someone capable of making rational decisions while they processed their grief. More importantly, they needed someone who could generate income while they figured out how to survive financially. The first month was about triage, identifying which bills were most urgent, which creditors would accept payment plans, and how to prevent our parents from losing their home while they were still too devastated to think clearly about financial planning. I kept my consulting job but negotiated to work remotely, setting up a home office in Marcus's old bedroom while my parents adjusted to having their adult daughter back under their roof. It felt strange and regressive, but it was also necessary. They needed me there, not just for practical support, but as proof that not all of their children had abandoned them. The emotional dynamics in our house were complex and heartbreaking. My parents were grieving not just Marcus's death, but the destruction of their financial security and their fundamental understanding of who their son had been. They'd lost their child and their retirement simultaneously, while discovering that the person they'd loved unconditionally had been capable of devastating betrayal. I was processing my own complicated grief. I mourned my brother, but I also felt rage at what he'd done to our parents and frustration that his death had made it impossible to hold him accountable for his actions. I was angry that I'd become responsible for fixing problems I hadn't created, while simultaneously feeling guilty for resenting my dead brother. Working from Marcus's bedroom was particularly surreal. I'd sit at the desk where he'd supposedly been developing his business plans, surrounded by his high school trophies and college textbooks, trying to rebuild the financial stability he destroyed. Sometimes I'd find evidence of his deception hidden in obvious places. Gambling websites bookmarked on his old computer, credit card offers addressed to our parents hidden in his dresser drawers, notes about betting strategies written on the back of family photos. Each discovery felt like a fresh betrayal, but also like puzzle pieces that helped me understand how thoroughly he'd planned his deception. This hadn't been impulsive behavior or a gambling addiction that got out of control. Marcus had systematically exploited our family's trust and love to fund his destruction. while maintaining the charming facade that kept us from questioning his actions until it was too late. 3 months after the funeral, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my career and my family's future. Instead of trying to manage the debt crisis while maintaining my existing job, I was going to start my own environmental consulting firm, specifically focused on helping small businesses implement sustainable practices. The decision seemed insane from a financial perspective. Starting a business while dealing with overwhelming family debt was the kind of risk that financial advisors would strongly discourage. But I'd been watching my parents try to rebuild their lives while working for other people, and I realized that employee income would never be sufficient to address the scale of debt Marcus had created. We needed the kind of financial growth that only comes from building something valuable, not just trading time for money. And I'd learned enough about environmental regulations and sustainable business practices through my consulting work to recognize genuine market opportunities that established firms were too large or inflexible to pursue effectively. Small manufacturing companies and service businesses were facing increasing pressure to adopt sustainable practices, but they lacked the resources to hire expensive consulting firms for comprehensive environmental assessments. There was a gap in the market for accessible, affordable environmental consulting that could help small businesses comply with regulations while reducing their operational costs. I'd also discovered that many of the sustainable practices I recommended actually saved businesses money in the long term through reduced energy consumption, waste minimization, and operational efficiency improvements. Companies that implemented my suggestions often saw measurable improvements in their bottom line within months, creating a value proposition that sold itself. Starting the business required every dollar I'd saved during my first year of employment, plus a small business loan that I qualified for based on my education and employment history. The loan application process was complicated by my parents' financial situation. I had to prove that their debt wouldn't affect my ability to repay the business loan. But eventually, I secured enough funding to establish Chen Environmental Solutions. The name was intentional. I wanted to honor my father's entrepreneurial legacy while distinguishing my business approach from Marcus's fictional ventures. Dad had built his auto repair business through competence, reliability, and genuine service to his community. I intended to build my consulting firm using the same principles, creating real value for clients while generating the income our family needed to recover from Marcus's betrayal. Working 18-hour days became my new normal. I'd spend mornings developing business plans and marketing materials, afternoons meeting with potential clients and conducting environmental assessments, and evenings handling the administrative work that kept the business running. The workload was exhausting, but it was also therapeutic in a way that surprised me. Every client I helped, every sustainability improvement I implemented, every dollar I earned felt like proof that hard work and competence could overcome even devastating setbacks. I was building something real and valuable, something that created genuine benefits for my clients while slowly rebuilding my family's financial foundation. My parents watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and worry. They were amazed by my dedication and impressed by my early business success, but they also felt guilty that their financial crisis had forced me to take such significant risks. "You shouldn't have to sacrifice your security because of our mistakes," Mom said one evening when I was working late on a proposal that could bring in $15,000 if I landed the contract. "These weren't your mistakes," I replied firmly. "And I'm not sacrificing anything. I'm building something that will benefit all of us in the long run." What I didn't tell her was that Marcus's betrayal had taught me something valuable about self-reliance and the importance of creating my own security, rather than depending on other people's promises. I was determined never to be in a position where someone else's actions could destroy my financial stability or my family's future. 6 months after starting Chen Environmental Solutions, I had landed enough clients to cover our family's basic living expenses, while making minimum payments on the debts Marcus had created. It wasn't comfortable, and we were still years away from financial recovery, but we were surviving and slowly moving in the right direction. More importantly, I was discovering that I had capabilities I'd never tested before. Not just technical expertise, but leadership skills, business instincts, and a level of determination that surprised everyone, including myself. The second year after Marcus's death was when the real work began. Not just the business building, but the systematic reconstruction of everything his lies had destroyed. By then, the initial shock had worn off, and we were left with the grinding reality of debt management, relationship repair, and the daily challenge of building something sustainable from the wreckage of our family's trust and finances. Chen Environmental Solutions was gaining traction, but success in consulting requires more than technical expertise. It demands credibility, reputation, and the kind of professional relationships that take years to develop. I was competing against established firms with decades of experience and client histories, while operating out of my childhood bedroom and using a dining room table as my conference space for client meetings. The early months taught me lessons about business development that no MBA program could have provided. I learned to present complex environmental assessments in language that non-technical business owners could understand and implement. I discovered that small businesses needed more than compliance guidance. They needed cost-effective solutions that could improve their operations while meeting regulatory requirements. My first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dad's auto repair shop had been struggling financially since Marcus's death, partly due to the emotional toll on Dad's ability to focus on work, but also because environmental regulations for automotive service businesses had become increasingly complex and expensive to navigate. "I've been putting off the EPA compliance upgrades for 2 years," Dad admitted during one of our weekly family financial meetings. "The equipment updates alone would cost $15,000, and I don't understand half the paperwork requirements. I've been thinking about just closing the shop and finding a job working for someone else." The idea of Dad giving up the business he'd spent 30 years building was devastating, but it also represented an opportunity to test my consulting approach on a business I understood intimately. I offered to conduct a comprehensive environmental assessment of Chen's auto repair pro bono, treating it as a case study that could demonstrate my capabilities to potential clients. What I discovered surprised everyone, including myself. Dad's shop was already closer to full compliance than he'd realized, and most of the required upgrades could be implemented gradually over several years, rather than all at once. More importantly, many of the environmental improvements would actually save money through reduced waste disposal costs and improved energy efficiency. I developed a 3-year implementation plan that would bring the shop into full compliance for less than half of what Dad had been quoted by other environmental consulting firms. The plan included detailed cost-benefit analyses showing how each upgrade would pay for itself within 18 months through operational savings. But the real value came from the documentation and reporting systems I created to help Dad track compliance ongoing. These systems were simple enough for him to manage independently, but comprehensive enough to satisfy regulatory requirements and streamline future inspections. The transformation in Dad's confidence and business performance was immediate and dramatic. Within 6 months of implementing my recommendations, Chen's auto repair was not only fully compliant, but had reduced operating costs by 23% while improving service quality and customer satisfaction. More importantly, Dad had regained his enthusiasm for the business he'd built. He started taking pride in being one of the most environmentally responsible auto shops in the region, and he began referring other small business owners to me for environmental consulting services. Word-of-mouth referrals from satisfied clients became the foundation of my business growth strategy. Small business owners talk to each other constantly, and environmental compliance is a common concern across industries. When Dad's colleagues saw the positive results at his shop, they wanted similar guidance for their own businesses. Within 8 months, I had a waiting list of potential clients, and was earning more from Chen Environmental Solutions than I'd made in my previous consulting job. But the real validation came when the Oregon Small Business Development Center invited me to present a workshop on cost-effective environmental compliance for small manufacturers. The workshop was scheduled for a Saturday morning in Portland, and I expected maybe 20 attendees, mostly business owners looking for basic guidance on regulatory requirements. Instead, over 70 people showed up, including representatives from the State Environmental Agency and several established consulting firms who apparently wanted to understand what this new competitor was offering their potential clients. My presentation focused on the practical, cost-effective approaches I'd developed through working with Dad's shop and my early clients. I demonstrated how environmental improvements could reduce operating costs while ensuring compliance, and I provided specific examples of implementation strategies that small businesses could afford and manage independently. The response exceeded my wildest expectations. I received 43 business cards from potential clients, 6 collaboration requests from other consultants, and an invitation to serve on the state's Small Business Environmental Advisory Committee. But the most significant outcome was a conversation with Dr. Sarah Mitchell from Oregon State University's Environmental Engineering Department. She'd attended the workshop because the university was developing a program to help small businesses access environmental consulting services, and she was impressed by my practical approach to compliance challenges. Most environmental consultants focus on large industrial clients because that's where the big contracts are, Dr. Mitchell explained over coffee after the workshop. But small businesses represent 60% of the state's economic activity, and they're struggling with environmental compliance because existing services are too expensive and complicated for their needs. She offered me an opportunity that would change the trajectory of my business and my career. The university had received a federal grant to develop innovative approaches to small business environmental support, and they were looking for practicing consultants to help design and implement pilot programs. The collaboration would involve working with university researchers to document and refine my consulting methodologies, then training other consultants to use similar approaches. It would also provide access to research resources and graduate student assistance that could help me develop more sophisticated tools and systems for small business environmental management. Most importantly, the university partnership would give me credibility and resources that individual consultants rarely achieve. Dr. Mitchell was essentially offering me the opportunity to become a recognized expert in small business environmental consulting while building a scalable business model that could serve clients throughout the Pacific Northwest. I accepted the partnership immediately, though it meant taking on additional responsibilities that would push my already intense work schedule to its absolute limits. I'd be conducting my regular client work, developing research projects with university graduate students, and creating training materials for other consultants, all while continuing to manage my family's financial recovery. The next 18 months became a blur of 18-hour workdays, weekend travel to client sites, and late-night research sessions with graduate students who were amazed by the practical insights I'd gained through hands-on consulting experience. We were developing innovative assessment tools, creating standardized implementation guides, and documenting case studies that demonstrated measurable benefits for small business clients. The university partnership also introduced me to funding opportunities I'd never considered: federal grants for small business environmental support, state programs for sustainable business development, and private foundation grants for innovative environmental education initiatives. I learned to write grant proposals, manage research budgets, and collaborate with academic researchers whose theoretical knowledge complemented my practical experience. By the end of my second year in business, Chen Environmental Solutions had grown from a desperate attempt to generate family income into a recognized leader in small business environmental consulting. I had 12 regular clients, a partnership with a major university, and a reputation that was attracting attention from environmental agencies and business organizations throughout the region. But the personal costs of this success were becoming increasingly apparent. I was working 7 days a week, traveling constantly, and had essentially no personal life outside of work and family obligations. The financial pressure had eased. We were making steady progress on debt reduction and had stabilized our family's living situation. But I was exhausting myself trying to maintain the pace of growth that our circumstances had initially required. Mom started expressing concern about my health and well-being. "Isabella, you're pushing yourself too hard," she said one evening when I'd fallen asleep at the kitchen table while reviewing client reports. "Marcus would never have wanted his problems to consume your entire life." The irony wasn't lost on me. I was working myself to exhaustion to repair damage caused by a brother who'd chosen the easy path of deception and theft rather than facing his problems honestly. But I was also discovering capabilities and achieving success that I never would have pursued if circumstances had been comfortable. The challenge was learning to sustain this level of achievement without destroying my health or missing opportunities for personal fulfillment beyond work. I needed to transition from crisis-driven overwork to strategic business management that could maintain growth while allowing for a more balanced life. The solution came from an unexpected source. One of my graduate student collaborators suggested that I was trying to do too much personally, instead of building systems that could operate effectively without my constant involvement. "You're thinking like a consultant instead of like a business owner," she observed. "Consultants trade time for money, but business owners create value through systems that work independently." That insight led me to start developing standardized processes, training materials, and client management systems that could reduce my personal involvement in routine consulting activities while maintaining service quality. I began hiring subcontractors to handle basic assessments and implementation support, while I focused on complex projects and business development activities that required my specific expertise. The transition from sole proprietor to business owner with employees and systems was challenging and sometimes frustrating, but it was also liberating. For the first time since Marcus's death, I started envisioning a future where success didn't require sacrificing everything else in my life. The breakthrough that would transform my consulting practice into something genuinely revolutionary came from an unexpected source: a frustrated restaurant owner in downtown Portland who was facing closure due to environmental violations she couldn't afford to fix. Maria Santos owned Estrella's Kitchen, a family restaurant that had been serving authentic Mexican food in the same location for 15 years. When the city's environmental compliance office cited her for grease disposal violations, outdated ventilation systems, and improper waste management protocols, The estimated cost of bringing her restaurant into full compliance was $87,000, more than the business generated in profit over 2 years. "I can't afford to fix everything they're demanding," Maria explained during our initial consultation, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd built a successful business only to watch it threatened by regulations she didn't understand. "But I also can't afford to lose my business license. My family depends on this restaurant, and my employees have been with me for years. I don't know what else to do." Traditional environmental consulting firms had quoted Maria prices between $15,000 and $20,000 just for the assessment and compliance planning, before any actual improvements were implemented. Their approach was comprehensive but expensive: detailed environmental impact studies, formal compliance plans, and recommendations for equipment upgrades that met or exceeded all regulatory requirements. But as I walked through Maria's restaurant, observing her operations and talking with her staff, I realized that most of her environmental challenges could be solved through creative problem solving and operational changes, rather than expensive equipment purchases. The grease disposal violations, for example, weren't happening because Maria was intentionally violating regulations. She simply didn't understand the proper procedures for grease collection and disposal, and the waste management company she'd been using wasn't providing adequate guidance or appropriate containers. I spent 3 hours researching grease disposal requirements and found a different waste management provider who specialized in restaurant services. They offered better containers, more frequent pickup schedules, and staff training on proper grease handling procedures, all for less money than Maria was currently paying her inadequate provider. The ventilation system challenges were more complex, but they didn't require the complete system replacement that other consultants had recommended. Maria's existing equipment could be brought into compliance through targeted upgrades to specific components, combined with modified cooking procedures that would reduce the burden on the ventilation system while actually improving food quality. Most significantly, I discovered that many of Maria's waste management issues could be addressed through operational changes that would actually save money while improving environmental compliance. Better inventory management would reduce food waste, improved supplier relationships could eliminate excessive packaging materials, and staff training on efficient cooking techniques would reduce energy consumption while maintaining food quality. Within 6 weeks, I'd helped Maria bring Estrella's Kitchen into full environmental compliance for a total cost of $12,000, including my consulting fees. More importantly, the operational improvements I'd recommended were saving her approximately $1,800 monthly in reduced utility costs, waste disposal fees, and food waste expenses. But the real breakthrough wasn't the successful outcome for Maria's restaurant. It was my realization that most small business environmental challenges could be solved through this integrated approach that combined regulatory compliance with operational efficiency improvements. Traditional environmental consulting treated compliance as a cost center, something businesses had to invest in to avoid penalties, but which didn't provide direct operational benefits. My approach treated environmental improvements as profit centers that could reduce operating costs while ensuring regulatory compliance. This insight led me to develop what I called the Integrated Sustainability Model, a consulting methodology that addressed environmental compliance, operational efficiency, and cost reduction simultaneously. Instead of viewing environmental regulations as burdens that businesses had to bear, I helped clients understand how sustainable practices could improve their bottom line while protecting the environment. The model had 4 core components that could be applied to any small business regardless of industry. First, I'd conduct a comprehensive operational assessment that identified environmental compliance issues alongside inefficiencies in resource usage, waste generation, and energy consumption. This integrated assessment was more valuable than traditional environmental audits because it revealed opportunities for improvement that affected both compliance and profitability. Second, I'd develop implementation plans that prioritized improvements based on cost-benefit analysis rather than regulatory urgency. Changes that provided immediate cost savings were implemented first, generating revenue that could fund more expensive compliance improvements. This approach made environmental compliance financially sustainable for small businesses that couldn't afford large upfront investments. Third, I'd provide staff training that combined environmental compliance education with operational efficiency techniques. Employees learned proper waste handling procedures alongside methods for reducing waste generation. They understood energy conservation requirements, while discovering how efficient practices could improve their working conditions and job satisfaction. Finally, I'd establish monitoring and reporting systems that tracked both environmental compliance metrics and operational performance indicators. These systems helped business owners understand the connection between sustainable practices and business success, while providing documentation for regulatory compliance. The integrated sustainability model was successful beyond anything I'd imagined. Within 6 months of developing the methodology, I had a waiting list of clients who'd heard about Maria's results and wanted similar improvements for their own businesses. Restaurant owners were particularly interested because food service operations face complex environmental regulations while operating on thin profit margins. But the model worked equally well for small manufacturers, retail businesses, service companies, and professional offices. Any business that consumed resources, generated waste, or used energy could benefit from the integrated approach. The university partnership proved invaluable for refining and documenting the methodology. Graduate students helped me collect data on client outcomes, analyze cost-benefit relationships, and develop standardized assessment tools that could be used consistently across different industries. Dr. Mitchell was fascinated by the results we were documenting. "You've essentially created a new consulting category," she observed, after reviewing case studies from 12 successful client implementations. "You're not just doing environmental consulting or management consulting. You're doing integrated sustainability consulting that addresses both compliance and profitability simultaneously." The data we collected was compelling. Clients who implemented my integrated sustainability model averaged 26% reductions in regulatory compliance costs compared to traditional consulting approaches. More importantly, they achieved average operational cost savings of 18% within the first year of implementation, meaning that environmental improvements actually generated net profit rather than representing pure compliance expenses. These results attracted attention from organizations I'd never thought would be interested in small business consulting. The Environmental Protection Agency invited me to present the integrated sustainability model at their annual Small Business Environmental Conference. The Small Business Administration asked me to develop training materials that could be used by their business development centers throughout the Pacific Northwest. Most significantly, the National Federation of Independent Business requested a detailed analysis of my methodology for potential inclusion in their member services program. If adopted nationally, my consulting approach could reach hundreds of thousands of small businesses that currently had limited access to affordable environmental compliance support. But the breakthrough that would establish my reputation beyond the small business consulting world came when Dr. Mitchell suggested that we apply for a major federal research grant to study the economic impacts of integrated sustainability consulting on small business performance. The grant application required documenting our methodology in academic language, providing statistical analysis of client outcomes, and proposing a multi-year research study that would test the model's effectiveness across different regions and industries. I spent 3 months working with university researchers to develop a grant proposal that positioned the integrated sustainability model as an innovative solution to the challenge of helping small businesses achieve environmental compliance while maintaining economic viability. The proposal emphasized that traditional approaches to environmental regulation created adversarial relationships between environmental protection and business success, while integrated sustainability consulting demonstrated that environmental improvements could actually enhance business performance when implemented strategically. We requested funding for a 3-year study that would implement the integrated sustainability model with 150 small businesses across 5 states, comparing their outcomes to control groups using traditional environmental consulting approaches. The study would measure not just environmental compliance results, but also business performance indicators, including profitability, employee satisfaction, customer retention, and long-term sustainability. When the National Science Foundation awarded us $1.2 million for the research project, I realized that my desperate attempt to rebuild my family's finances had evolved into something much larger and more significant than I'd ever imagined. The grant meant that my consulting methodology would be tested rigorously and documented formally, potentially establishing integrated sustainability consulting as a recognized field within both environmental consulting and small business development. It also meant that I'd have resources to hire additional staff, expand my client capacity, and develop training programs that could help other consultants implement similar approaches. Most importantly, the federal recognition validated that the approach I'd developed through necessity and practical experience represented genuine innovation that could benefit thousands of small businesses struggling with environmental compliance challenges. Standing in the university conference room where Dr. Mitchell announced the grant award, surrounded by graduate students and fellow researchers who were excited about the possibilities this funding would create, I realized that Marcus's betrayal had inadvertently led me to discover capabilities and opportunities I never would have pursued under comfortable circumstances. The skills I'd developed through rebuilding my family's finances, the insights I'd gained through working with struggling small businesses, and the determination I'd cultivated through surviving devastation had combined to create something valuable that extended far beyond my personal circumstances. For the first time since Marcus's death, I felt genuine gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. even though I wouldn't wish the pain and struggle on anyone. The National Science Foundation grant transformed Chen Environmental Solutions from a regional consulting practice into a nationally recognized research and implementation hub for integrated sustainability consulting. But with federal funding came responsibilities and opportunities that required a complete restructuring of how I approached business operations, client relationships, and professional development. The first challenge was scaling up operations to handle 150 participating businesses across 5 states, while maintaining the personalized service quality that had built my reputation. I couldn't personally visit every client location or conduct every assessment, which meant developing training programs and standardized procedures that would allow other consultants to implement my methodology effectively. I hired 6 environmental consultants with different industry backgrounds, each bringing expertise that complemented my own experience. Sarah Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, had worked with food service operations for 8 years and understood restaurant environmental challenges better than anyone I'd met. Michael Rodriguez brought manufacturing experience that proved invaluable for working with small production facilities. Lisa Thompson's background in retail operations helped us develop approaches for businesses that most environmental consultants overlooked entirely. Training my new team required documenting every aspect of the integrated sustainability model in detailed procedures manuals, case study examples, and assessment protocols that could be applied consistently, regardless of who was conducting the work. This process forced me to analyze and formalize consulting approaches I'd developed intuitively through trial and error, turning practical experience into teachable methodology. The documentation process revealed gaps in my approach that I hadn't recognized when working alone. Lisa identified cultural sensitivity issues that affected how environmental recommendations were received by businesses owned by recent immigrants. Michael discovered that my assessment tools needed modification for businesses that operated seasonally or had highly variable production schedules. Sarah found ways to streamline the implementation process for businesses that had extremely limited time availability for staff training. Each team member's insights improved the overall methodology while helping us develop specialized approaches for different types of businesses. The integrated sustainability model became more robust and effective through collaboration than it had ever been as a solo consulting approach. Managing the federal research requirements added another layer of complexity that pushed my business skills in directions I'd never anticipated. We needed to collect detailed performance data from every participating business, document implementation processes with academic rigor, and coordinate with university researchers who were analyzing our results using statistical methods that required specific data formats and collection protocols. Dr. Mitchell assigned 2 graduate students to work full-time with my team, helping us design data collection systems and ensuring that our practical consulting work met the documentation standards required for federal research. Working with academic researchers taught me to think about client outcomes in ways that went beyond immediate business results to include broader economic and environmental impacts that could be measured and compared systematically. The research component also required working with control groups, businesses that received traditional environmental consulting services, so that researchers could compare outcomes between integrated sustainability consulting and conventional approaches. Coordinating with other consulting firms to provide comparable services for research purposes created professional relationships and industry connections that proved valuable beyond the immediate research objectives. 6 months into the federal research project, preliminary data was showing results that exceeded even my optimistic expectations. Businesses working with my team were achieving environmental compliance at rates 93% higher than the control groups, while also demonstrating operational cost savings that averaged 24% during the first year of implementation. More significantly, participating businesses were reporting improvements in employee satisfaction, customer retention, and community relationships that weren't directly related to environmental compliance, but seemed to result from the operational efficiency and sustainability focus that characterized the integrated approach. These unexpected benefits attracted attention from business organizations and economic development agencies that had never considered environmental consulting relevant to their work. The Oregon Business Development Commission invited me to speak at their annual conference about using sustainability initiatives to improve small business competitiveness. The Economic Development Administration asked me to consult on a pilot program for helping rural businesses access environmental compliance resources that could also support economic development objectives. 3 different chambers of commerce requested workshops on how their members could benefit from integrated sustainability approaches. Each speaking opportunity and consulting request expanded my professional network, while providing insights into how the integrated sustainability model could be applied to economic development challenges beyond environmental compliance. I started developing relationships with economic development professionals, small business association leaders, and regional planning organizations who saw sustainability consulting as a tool for supporting business growth rather than just regulatory compliance. The business growth that resulted from these expanded professional relationships required another round of hiring and organizational development. By the end of the first year of the federal research project, Chen Environmental Solutions employed 12 full-time consultants, 4 administrative staff members, and was working with independent contractors in 6 states. Revenue had grown from the desperate survival-focused income I generated during the first year after Marcus's death to over $800,000 annually. More importantly, the business was profitable enough to support continued growth while allowing me to pay down my family's remaining debt at an accelerated pace. But the most significant validation came when the International Association of Environmental Professionals invited me to present a keynote address at their annual conference in Denver. The IAEP represented over 15,000 environmental professionals worldwide, and keynote invitations were typically reserved for established industry leaders with decades of experience and recognition. My presentation, titled Beyond Compliance: Creating Economic Value Through Environmental Innovation, would be delivered to an audience of environmental consultants, corporate environmental managers, and government regulators from 37 countries. The opportunity represented recognition that my methodology had implications for environmental consulting practices globally, not just for small businesses in the American Pacific Northwest. Preparing for the international keynote required developing presentation materials that could communicate the integrated sustainability model to environmental professionals from different cultural and regulatory backgrounds. I worked with university researchers to create case studies that demonstrated universal principles, while acknowledging that implementation details would vary based on local regulations, economic conditions, and cultural practices. The presentation itself was both thrilling and terrifying. Standing before an audience of established environmental professionals, many of whom had advanced degrees and decades more experience than I did, I felt acutely aware that my expertise had come from necessity and practical application rather than formal training in business or environmental management. But the response was overwhelmingly positive. During the question and answer session, environmental consultants from Germany, Japan, Australia, and Brazil asked detailed questions about how the methodology could be adapted for their regulatory environments and business cultures. Corporate environmental managers wanted to understand how integrated sustainability approaches could be scaled up for larger operations. Government regulators were interested in how policy changes could encourage businesses to adopt voluntary sustainability improvements beyond minimum compliance requirements. The most meaningful feedback came from a small business environmental consultant from Canada, who approached me after the presentation to say that my work had inspired her to completely rethink her consulting approach. "I've been treating environmental compliance as something businesses have to endure," she admitted. "You've shown me how it can become something that actually helps them succeed." 3 months after the Denver keynote, I received an invitation that would establish my reputation permanently within the environmental consulting industry. The Environmental Business Journal, the leading publication for environmental consulting professionals, wanted to feature my methodology as their cover story for the annual Innovation in Environmental Services issue. The article would include detailed analysis of the integrated sustainability model, case studies demonstrating measurable outcomes, and commentary from industry experts about the potential for integrated approaches to transform environmental consulting practices. It would also include a profile of my professional development and the personal circumstances that had led me to develop innovative consulting approaches. Working with the journalist who was writing the feature story required discussing Marcus's death and the financial crisis that had motivated my transition from traditional consulting to entrepreneurial business development. I'd been reluctant to share personal details publicly, but the journalist convinced me that understanding the context that had sparked my innovation would help other environmental professionals recognize opportunities to develop creative solutions within their own practices. When the Environmental Business Journal article was published, featuring my photograph on the cover alongside the headline, "Integrated Sustainability: The Future of Environmental Consulting," I realized that my desperate attempt to save my family's financial future had accidentally launched a career that was influencing environmental consulting practices internationally. The article generated interview requests from environmental industry publications in 7 countries, consulting opportunities with multinational corporations, and invitations to serve on advisory committees for professional organizations that shaped environmental consulting standards and practices. But perhaps most importantly, It attracted the attention of a documentary filmmaker who was producing a series about innovative approaches to environmental challenges facing small businesses. The filmmaker wanted to follow several of my clients through the integrated sustainability implementation process, documenting both the environmental improvements and the business benefits that resulted from the methodology. The documentary would provide visibility for my clients' businesses while demonstrating the practical applications of integrated sustainability consulting to audiences who might never read environmental industry publications. It would also establish my methodology as part of a broader movement toward collaborative approaches to environmental protection that benefited both businesses and communities. Standing in my new office building, a former warehouse that we'd renovated using integrated sustainability principles as a demonstration project, surrounded by staff members who were implementing consulting projects across multiple states, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that devastating phone call about Marcus's accident 3 years earlier. The grief and financial crisis that had seemed insurmountable had somehow catalyzed the development of capabilities and opportunities I never would have pursued under comfortable circumstances. More importantly, the work I was doing was creating genuine value for hundreds of small businesses while advancing environmental protection objectives that aligned with my personal values and professional interests. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 years and 4 months after Marcus's funeral. I was reviewing quarterly performance reports from our federal research project when my assistant knocked on my office door with an expression I'd never seen before, part excitement, part disbelief. "Isabella," she said, holding a cordless phone with her hand covering the mouthpiece. "There's someone from the White House on the phone. They want to speak with you about the President's Small Business Innovation Award." For a moment, I thought she was joking. The President's Small Business Innovation Award was one of the most prestigious recognitions in American business, given annually to entrepreneurs whose innovations had created significant economic impact while addressing important social or environmental challenges. Recipients included founders of companies that had revolutionized entire industries, developed breakthrough technologies, or created thousands of jobs through innovative business models. I was running a successful consulting firm with a dozen employees, not building the next Google or developing revolutionary medical devices. The idea that my work qualified for presidential recognition seemed absurd, but the voice on the phone was serious, professional, and very much real. Jennifer Walsh from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy explained that my integrated sustainability consulting methodology had been nominated by a consortium of small business organizations, environmental agencies, and economic development groups who had observed its impact on businesses participating in the federal research project. "Dr. Chen-Rodriguez," she said, using the honorary doctorate that Oregon State University had awarded me 6 months earlier. "The preliminary data from your research project shows remarkable outcomes. Small businesses implementing your methodology are achieving environmental compliance rates above 90%, while simultaneously improving their profitability by an average of 28%. These results represent exactly the kind of innovation that the President's Award Program was designed to recognize." The nomination process would require detailed documentation of my methodology's development, comprehensive analysis of its economic and environmental impacts, and testimony from clients, research partners, and industry experts about the significance of the innovation. If selected as a finalist, I'd be invited to Washington, D.C. for interviews with the selection committee and potentially a meeting with the President himself. "The selection committee is particularly interested in your personal journey," Jennifer continued. "The fact that you developed this methodology while rebuilding your family's finances after a personal tragedy demonstrates the kind of resilience and innovation that American entrepreneurship represents at its best." Over the next 2 months, I worked with university researchers, my consulting team, and federal project coordinators to compile the most comprehensive documentation of integrated sustainability consulting that had ever been assembled. We analyzed data from over 200 client implementations, calculated economic impacts across multiple industries and geographic regions, and documented environmental benefits that extended far beyond regulatory compliance. The numbers were staggering, even to me. Businesses that had implemented the integrated sustainability model were generating an average of $43,000 in annual cost savings, while reducing their environmental impact by measurable amounts across energy consumption, waste generation, and resource efficiency. The methodology had been replicated successfully in 12 states, adapted for use in Canada and Mexico, and was being studied by environmental consulting firms in Europe and Asia. But the personal impact stories were what made the data meaningful. Restaurant owners like Maria Santos had not only achieved environmental compliance, but had used the operational savings to expand their businesses and hire additional employees. Small manufacturers had discovered that sustainability improvements helped them compete more effectively against larger companies while reducing their regulatory compliance costs. Service businesses had found that environmental responsibility enhanced their reputation with customers and improved employee retention. The selection committee interview took place in a conference room in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, just steps from the White House. 5 committee members, including representatives from the Small Business Administration, Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Commerce, and National Science Foundation, spent 2 hours asking detailed questions about my methodology, its development process, and its potential for broader application. What sets your approach apart from traditional environmental consulting? Asked Dr. Patricia Williams from the EPA. Traditional environmental consulting treats compliance as a cost that businesses have to bear, I explained. My approach treats environmental improvement as an investment that can generate returns through operational efficiency, cost reduction, and competitive advantage. Instead of asking businesses to choose between profitability and environmental responsibility, I help them discover that these objectives can be mutually reinforcing. The committee was particularly interested in how I developed the methodology without formal business training or extensive experience in environmental consulting. You essentially created a new consulting category through practical experimentation, observed James Patterson from the Small Business Administration. That kind of innovation often comes from people who aren't constrained by industry assumptions about what's possible. 3 weeks later, Jennifer Walsh called to inform me that I'd been selected as one of 3 finalists for the President's Small Business Innovation Award. The final selection would be announced at a White House ceremony in June, with all 3 finalists being recognized for their contributions to American innovation and economic development. But first, there would be a private meeting with the President to discuss my work and its implications for small business policy and environmental regulation. The meeting was scheduled for May 15th in the Oval Office with just the President, his science advisor, and myself. Walking into the Oval Office was surreal beyond anything I could have imagined. The President greeted me warmly, having clearly been briefed on my work and personal background. He wanted to understand how my methodology could be scaled nationally, and what policy changes might encourage more businesses to adopt voluntary environmental improvements. Isabella, he said, what you've accomplished represents exactly the kind of American innovation that creates jobs while protecting the environment. Your work proves that we don't have to choose between economic growth and environmental responsibility. We can achieve both objectives simultaneously through smart business practices. We discussed the potential for incorporating integrated sustainability principles into federal small business support programs, environmental regulations that could encourage innovation rather than just compliance, and economic development initiatives that could help rural and underserved communities access environmental consulting resources. The conversation lasted 40 minutes, but the most meaningful moment came when the President asked about my family's response to my success. My parents are incredibly proud, I said, but I think they're also amazed that something so positive came out of such a devastating experience. My father keeps telling people that his daughter turned a family tragedy into a way to help thousands of other families build stronger businesses. The President nodded thoughtfully. That's what resilience looks like, he said. Taking the worst experiences life can offer, and transforming them into opportunities to serve others. That's the American spirit at its finest. The White House ceremony on June 12th was attended by over 200 business leaders, government officials, and journalists. All 3 finalists gave presentations about their innovations, but the President's Small Business Innovation Award was presented to Chen Environmental Solutions for developing, quote, methodology that demonstrates how environmental responsibility can enhance rather than constrain business success, creating a model for sustainable economic development that can be replicated nationally and internationally. Standing at the podium in the East Room of the White House, holding an award signed by the President and witnessed by some of the most influential business and policy leaders in the country, I thought about Marcus and the devastating phone call that had started this impossible journey. The award citation mentioned my exceptional resilience in developing innovative solutions during personal adversity, but it also emphasized the broader significance of integrated sustainability consulting for American small business competitiveness and environmental protection. During the reception following the ceremony, I was approached by venture capital firms interested in funding expansion of my methodology, multinational corporations wanting to license the integrated sustainability approach for their supplier development programs, and international development organizations exploring applications for emerging economies. The most intriguing opportunity came from Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, director of the Global Environmental Business Network, an international organization that promoted sustainable business practices in developing countries. Isabella, she said, your methodology could revolutionize how environmental consulting is delivered in countries where small businesses represent the majority of economic activity but lack access to affordable compliance support. Would you be interested in piloting integrated sustainability consulting in Central America and Southeast Asia? The conversation continued over dinner with my parents, who had flown to Washington to attend the White House ceremony. Watching Dad's face as he listened to Dr. Morrison describe opportunities to implement my methodology internationally, I could see his pride in what his daughter had accomplished, but also his amazement that work which had started in Marcus's bedroom had achieved recognition at the highest levels of American government and business. Marcus would have been so proud of you, Mom said quietly as we walked through downtown Washington after dinner. He always said you were the smartest person in our family, but I don't think even he imagined you were capable of something like this. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus's lies and betrayal had forced me to develop capabilities I never would have pursued under comfortable circumstances. His fake death had created the crisis that catalyzed my transformation from struggling consultant to nationally recognized innovator. But standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, looking back toward the White House where I had spent the day being honored for my contributions to American business and environmental protection, I realized that the journey wasn't really about Marcus anymore. It was about discovering that the most devastating experiences can become the foundation for the most meaningful achievements, that necessity can unlock capabilities we never knew we possessed, and that sometimes the greatest service we can provide others emerges from our own deepest struggles. The recognition was gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that my work was creating genuine value for thousands of small business owners who were building stronger, more sustainable enterprises, while protecting the environment for future generations. Tomorrow, I would begin planning the international expansion that could bring integrated sustainability consulting to developing countries where environmental challenges and economic development needs intersected in ways that traditional consulting approaches had never addressed effectively. But tonight, I was simply grateful for the journey that had brought me to this moment, even though it had started with the worst betrayal imaginable. While I was building an internationally recognized consulting firm and receiving presidential awards, the people who had enabled Marcus's deception were experiencing consequences that took years to fully reveal themselves. The ripple effects of his fake death extended far beyond our immediate family, creating a web of destruction that touched everyone who had believed in him, trusted him, or tried to help him during his final months. The most devastating impact fell on our parents, who had not only lost their son, but had their entire understanding of reality systematically destroyed. Mom had always prided herself on being able to read people, especially her own children. Her ability to detect when students were lying or struggling had made her an exceptional teacher for 23 years. But Marcus's elaborate deception had convinced her that her maternal instincts were completely unreliable. "How could I not have known?" became her constant refrain during the first year after his death. She would sit in his bedroom, searching through his belongings for clues she might have missed, evidence that could have warned her that something was wrong. She found the gambling websites bookmarked on his computer, the credit card offers hidden in his dresser, and the increasingly desperate phone messages from creditors that he'd never mentioned to the family. Each discovery felt like a fresh betrayal, but also like evidence of her failure as a mother. She'd convinced herself that if she'd been more perceptive, more involved, more suspicious of his explanations, she could have prevented both his death and the financial devastation he'd caused. Dad's response was different, but equally destructive to his sense of self. As an engineer, he'd built his identity around logical analysis and careful evaluation of evidence. He'd spent 30 years making business decisions based on systematic assessment of risks and opportunities. But Marcus had manipulated him using emotional appeals and fabricated documentation that bypassed his analytical instincts completely. "I looked at his business plan," Dad would say, reviewing the documents Marcus had presented during those crucial family meetings. The numbers seemed reasonable, the market analysis looked professional, and he had answers for every question I asked. I thought I was being prudent by asking for documentation and taking time to consider the investment. What Dad couldn't accept was that Marcus had anticipated these objections and prepared responses specifically designed to satisfy an engineer's need for logical analysis. The business plan was sophisticated because Marcus had hired someone to create it. The market research was compelling because it had been plagiarized from legitimate consulting reports. The financial projections were convincing because they were based on real businesses that had succeeded using similar models. Dad had been manipulated by someone who understood exactly how his mind worked and had crafted deception specifically to exploit his decision-making process. This realization undermined his confidence in his own judgment so profoundly that he started second-guessing every business decision at the auto shop, from inventory purchases to pricing strategies. The financial strain continued long after Marcus's funeral, creating daily reminders of how thoroughly they'd been deceived. The second mortgage payments consumed nearly 40% of their monthly income, forcing them to defer maintenance on their home, eliminate discretionary spending, and postpone retirement indefinitely. Dad's auto repair business began suffering as his confidence problems affected his interactions with customers and suppliers. He'd always been decisive and authoritative when diagnosing car problems or recommending repairs, but now he questioned every assessment and sought second opinions for decisions he'd previously made instinctively. Customers noticed the change. Where Dad had once provided quick, confident diagnoses and fair pricing, he now seemed hesitant and uncertain. Some longtime customers started taking their cars elsewhere, interpreting his new caution as incompetence, rather than understanding it as the result of profound psychological trauma. The business decline created additional financial pressure that compounded their debt problems. Monthly revenue dropped by 23% during the year following Marcus's death, not because Dad's technical skills had deteriorated, but because his confidence in his own judgment had been destroyed by his son's manipulation. Mom's teaching suffered similarly, though the impact was more subtle. She'd always been able to connect with difficult students because she could intuitively understand their motivations and concerns. But Marcus's deception had shattered her faith in her ability to read people accurately, making her second-guess her instincts about student behavior and needs. Parents who had previously sought her advice about their children's academic and emotional development noticed that she seemed less confident in her recommendations. Her classroom management became more rigid and rule-based, lacking the intuitive flexibility that had made her an exceptional educator. The psychological impact extended to their social relationships within the community. Friends and colleagues had been aware of their financial support for Marcus's business venture, and some had even expressed admiration for their willingness to invest in their son's entrepreneurial ambitions. After Marcus's death, these relationships became complicated by unspoken questions about what had really happened with the business money. People were too polite to ask directly, but my parents could sense the curiosity and speculation in social interactions that had previously been comfortable and natural. Church members who had heard about the business investment would ask carefully worded questions about whether Marcus had left any business assets that could help with the family's financial situation. Neighbors who knew about the second mortgage would make sympathetic comments about the challenges of dealing with the deceased child's financial obligations. Each interaction reinforced my parents' sense of shame about having been deceived so thoroughly by their own son. They felt simultaneously like victims of his manipulation and like failures who should have recognized the deception before it destroyed their financial security. The extended family dynamics were equally painful to navigate. Dad's brother had advised against the initial $75,000 investment, and his warnings about supporting unproven business ventures had been ignored in favor of Marcus's emotional appeals about family loyalty and support. Uncle Robert never said, "I told you so," but his careful avoidance of financial topics during family gatherings felt like constant reminder of his prescient caution. My cousins, who had initially been impressed by Marcus's entrepreneurial ambitions, now treated his memory with the kind of careful silence reserved for family tragedies that nobody wanted to discuss in detail. Mom's family had been more supportive of the business investment initially, but their response to Marcus's death revealed how thoroughly he'd manipulated their perceptions as well. Several aunts mentioned having received phone calls from Marcus during his final months, asking for advice about business challenges and expressing gratitude for the family's emotional support during difficult times. These conversations had been part of his elaborate deception, designed to create witnesses who could testify to his legitimate business struggles if anyone later questioned what had happened to the investment money. He'd been building an emotional narrative that would explain business failure as external circumstances rather than fraud, ensuring that his family would remember him as an unlucky entrepreneur rather than a calculating thief. The most devastating discovery came 18 months after his death, when a collection agency contacted my parents about gambling debts that Marcus had incurred using their names and financial information during the weeks immediately before his supposed accident. These final debts weren't the result of long-term addiction or gradual escalation of risky behavior. They represented desperate final attempts to generate enough money to repay some of what he'd stolen from the family before his deception was discovered. Marcus had been gambling frantically during his last weeks, using every available credit source to try to win enough money to cover at least part of his theft. The collection agency had documentation showing that Marcus had placed over $60,000 in bets during the 2 weeks before his death, using credit cards and cash advances that he'd obtained through identity theft. Every bet had been designed to generate immediate, large returns that could have funded partial repayment to our parents. But the gambling had failed, as it always did, leaving him deeper in debt to both his family and dangerous creditors who had no patience for elaborate repayment plans or emotional appeals about family loyalty. This final revelation completed the picture of Marcus's last months, a desperate cycle of theft, gambling, and escalating deception that had culminated in the elaborate fake death scheme when all other options had been exhausted. For my parents, learning about Marcus's final desperate gambling spree was somehow more devastating than discovering his business fraud. The business deception could be rationalized as ambition gone wrong or addiction-driven poor judgment. But the systematic identity theft and last-minute gambling revealed calculation and deliberate cruelty that was impossible to reconcile with their memories of the son they'd loved. Mom stopped visiting Marcus's grave after this discovery. She couldn't bear to stand at the memorial site knowing that the person buried there, or supposedly buried there, had spent his final weeks systematically stealing from his own family while planning an elaborate scheme to escape accountability for his actions. Dad removed Marcus's photos from the auto shop office, unable to look at images of the son who had destroyed not just their financial security, but their faith in their own judgment and their ability to trust people they loved. The community gradually learned pieces of the truth through gossip, credit agency inquiries, and court filings related to the fraudulent debt disputes. My parents' reputation shifted from being seen as victims of tragedy to being perceived as people who had been foolish enough to be extensively defrauded by their own child. This social stigma compounded their emotional and financial struggles, creating isolation at precisely the time when they most needed community support and understanding. By the time I was receiving national recognition for my business success, my parents had spent 3 years living with the consequences of Marcus's elaborate betrayal while watching their daughter build extraordinary achievements from the crisis he had created. The contrast between their declining circumstances and my rising success created complex emotions that they struggled to process. Pride in my accomplishments mixed with grief for their losses, gratitude for my support shadowed by shame about needing help from the child they should have been able to assist. The discovery that would shatter everything I thought I knew about grief, family, and the last 3 years of my life happened on what should have been a celebration. I was in Miami for the Global Environmental Business Conference, where I'd been invited as the keynote speaker to discuss expanding integrated sustainability consulting to Latin American markets. After my presentation, Dr. Morrison from the Global Environmental Business Network suggested we take a working dinner at a beachfront restaurant to discuss the details of our international pilot program. "There's this wonderful little place in Sunset Cove that serves the best seafood in South Florida," she said. "It's about 40 minutes from here, but the drive along the coast is beautiful, and we'll have privacy to talk through the implementation timeline." Sunset Cove turned out to be exactly the kind of charming beach town that attracts people seeking to disappear from their previous lives. Pastel-colored buildings, palm trees swaying in the ocean breeze, and the kind of laid-back atmosphere where nobody asks too many questions about your past or your reasons for being there. The Driftwood Grill was crowded with tourists and locals enjoying the sunset happy hour, and we had to wait 20 minutes for a table. Dr. Morrison suggested we grab drinks at the bar while we waited, and I was scanning the dining room to estimate how long our wait might be when I saw him. Marcus was behind the bar, mixing drinks and chatting with customers as if he belonged there, as if he'd been working there for months or years. He was tanned, slightly thinner than I remembered, and his hair was longer and sun-bleached. But it was unmistakably my brother, the brother whose funeral I'd attended, whose grave our mother visited every Sunday, whose death had catalyzed the most transformative period of my life. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. Grief can create optical illusions, and I'd heard about people seeing deceased loved ones in crowds or familiar places. But as I stared, Marcus looked up from the drink he was preparing, and our eyes met across the restaurant. His face went completely white. A bottle slipped from his hands and shattered on the floor behind the bar, causing other bartenders and nearby customers to turn toward the commotion. But Marcus didn't look away from me. He stood frozen, pieces of broken glass at his feet, staring at me with an expression of absolute terror. "Isabella!" Dr. Morrison's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." The phrase was so perfectly accurate that I almost laughed. Except that nothing about this situation was funny. I was looking at my dead brother, who was very much alive, working as a bartender in a Florida beach town while our parents struggled with debt and grief that he had created through an elaborate scheme to fake his own death. I need to step outside for a moment, I managed to tell Dr. Morrison. There's someone I need to speak with. I walked to the restaurant's back exit, knowing that Marcus would follow me. He couldn't pretend he hadn't seen me, couldn't continue mixing drinks and chatting with customers, while his supposedly dead sister stood 15 feet away from him. Whatever new life he'd built in Sunset Cove was about to collide with the reality of his past in ways that he'd probably convinced himself would never happen. He appeared in the alley behind the restaurant 5 minutes later, having apparently made some excuse to step away from his shift. He was still wearing his bartender's apron, and his hands were shaking as he approached me. "Isabella," he said, and his voice carried the same charm that had convinced our parents to mortgage their future for his imaginary business. "I can explain everything." "Can you?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "Can you explain how you're alive when we buried you 3 years ago? Can you explain why our parents have spent every day since your funeral dealing with debt you created while you've been serving drinks to tourists in paradise?" Marcus looked around the alley as if he were checking for escape routes or making sure we weren't being overheard. "It's complicated," he said finally. "I was in serious trouble, Isabella. The kind of trouble that doesn't get solved by paying money or going to counseling. There were people who would have killed me if I hadn't disappeared." "So you decided to kill yourself instead?" I asked. "You decided to let our parents think their son was dead, rather than asking for help or facing the consequences of your gambling addiction?" "You don't understand the situation I was in," Marcus said, and I could hear the defensive anger that had always appeared when anyone questioned his decisions. "I owed money to people who don't negotiate payment plans. They don't care about family circumstances or rehabilitation programs. They solve payment problems by making people disappear permanently. So you made yourself disappear first," I said. "And you made our parents pay for the privilege of grieving your fake death while you started over with a new life." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, apparently recognizing that his usual charm and manipulation tactics weren't going to work in this situation. "I never meant for it to go on this long," he said finally. "I thought I could get established here, maybe save some money, and then find a way to let you know I was alive. I thought about calling or writing letters, but the longer I waited, the harder it became to explain." "The harder it became to face the consequences," I corrected. "You've been hiding here for 3 years while Mom visits your empty grave every Sunday. You've been mixing drinks and enjoying beach sunsets while Dad's business has been failing because he lost confidence in his own judgment after you manipulated him so thoroughly." "How are they doing?" Marcus asked, and for the first time I heard genuine concern in his voice rather than calculated manipulation. "They're surviving," I said. "Barely. They're $70,000 in debt from the money they gave you, plus another $38,000 from credit cards you opened in their names. Dad's auto shop is struggling because he can't trust his own judgment anymore. Mom can't look at your pictures without crying. They've essentially lost their son and their financial security simultaneously." Marcus closed his eyes, and I could see that he was processing information he probably tried not to think about during his 3 years of beach town anonymity. "But here's what's really interesting," I continued. "Your fake death forced me to rebuild everything from nothing. I started my own business, developed innovative consulting approaches, and built something extraordinary from the crisis you created. I just received the President's Small Business Innovation Award 3 months ago. I'm expanding internationally. Your betrayal accidentally launched the most successful period of my life." Marcus opened his eyes and stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Isabella, that's incredible. I always knew you were capable of amazing things." "Don't," I said sharply. "Don't try to take credit for my success, or pretend that your fake death was somehow a gift that motivated me to achieve more than I would have otherwise. You destroyed our family's financial security and emotional stability for entirely selfish reasons. Any positive outcomes happened despite your actions, not because of them." "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked, and I could hear the fear in his voice. "Are you going to call the police? Tell our parents that I'm alive?" It was the question I'd been dreading since the moment I recognized him behind the bar. What was my obligation to our parents, who deserved to know that their son was alive? What was my obligation to Marcus, who was clearly terrified of the consequences of his deception being revealed? What was my obligation to myself after building a new life on the foundation of grief that had turned out to be based on lies? "I don't know," I said honestly. "I need time to think about this. But Marcus, you need to understand that your choices don't end with me. You've committed fraud, identity theft, and insurance fraud. You've caused psychological trauma to our parents that has affected their health, their business, and their ability to function normally. There are legal and moral consequences that don't disappear just because you've been hiding in Florida for 3 years. I know, he said quietly. I've thought about those things every day since I got here. But I also know that coming back wouldn't fix anything I've broken. It would just create new problems for everyone. That's not your decision to make anymore, I said. You lost the right to make decisions for our family when you decided to fake your death, rather than dealing with your problems honestly. I walked back toward the restaurant, leaving Marcus standing in the alley with the weight of his choices and their consequences finally catching up to him after 3 years of tropical escapism. Dr. Morrison was waiting at our table, having apparently secured seating while I was confronting my supposedly dead brother in the alley behind the restaurant. Isabella, you look shaken, she said with concern. Is everything all right? I just encountered someone from my past, I said. Which was technically true, while being completely inadequate to describe what had just happened. Someone I thought was dead. Over dinner, I tried to focus on our discussion of international consulting opportunities, but my mind kept returning to the impossible conversation I just had with Marcus. Dr. Morrison was outlining implementation timelines for pilot programs in Costa Rica and Guatemala, but I was thinking about the phone call I would eventually have to make to our parents. How do you tell people that their grief has been based on lies? How do you explain that the son they've been mourning is alive and well, serving cocktails to tourists while they struggle with debt he created? How do you balance justice with mercy when the person who's caused the most damage is someone you love, despite everything they've done? After dinner, I drove back to Miami in silence, processing the reality that nothing I thought I knew about the last 3 years was actually true. My success hadn't been built on recovering from tragedy. It had been built on recovering from betrayal that was even more elaborate and cruel than I'd realized. Marcus had not only stolen our family's money and destroyed our financial security, he had stolen our grief, our healing process, and our understanding of what had actually happened to our family. He had let us mourn him, while he created a new life, free from the consequences of his actions. But as I sat in my hotel room that night, staring at my phone and trying to decide whether to call our parents, I realized that knowing Marcus was alive didn't actually change the fundamental reality of what I'd built over the past 3 years. My business was still successful because of the work I'd done, the innovations I'd developed, and the value I'd created for clients. My success hadn't depended on Marcus being dead. It had depended on my decision to rebuild our family's life after his betrayal, regardless of whether that betrayal had ended in death or disappearance. The question wasn't whether I should reveal that Marcus was alive. The question was whether doing so would create more healing or more damage for people who had already been hurt, more than anyone should have to endure. I picked up my phone and dialed our parents' number. It was time to tell them that their son was alive, and then help them decide what justice and forgiveness looked like when the person who'd hurt you most was someone you'd never stopped loving. Mom, I said when she answered, I need to tell you something that's going to change everything we thought we knew about Marcus. Are you sitting down? The conversation that followed was the hardest of my life, but it was also the beginning of the final chapter in our family's long journey toward healing and truth. Sometimes the most shocking discoveries force us to realize that the strength we've built through surviving lies is more real and valuable than the lies themselves. And sometimes, the best revenge really is living so well that you can afford to choose forgiveness, even when the person who hurt you doesn't deserve it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.